Almost all the 4 pro-democracy leaders have resigned from Hong Kong's legislature. The resignations are in protest against the forced removal of 4 of their colleagues over endangering national security. The en masse resignation of 15 remaining pro-democracy lawmakers has effectively removed the political opposition from Hong Kong's Legislative Council, which is also known as LEGO. And with this, the city's 70-seat legislature now has only 2 remaining opposition members.
今日係我哋民主派喺立法會嘅最後一天，我哋喺琴晚已經宣布咗，我哋係集體總辭。今日咧，我哋所有同事先後咧，都係會喺今日結束之前咧，就交上我哋嘅辭職信嘅。香港嘅立法會嚟到今日，你就會見到由今日開始係一個全新嘅面貌。 民主派再唔會喺議會當中可以係履行到監察政府施政嘅工作。呢一個係特區政府同埋中央政府自己製造嘅一個係破壞憲政安排嘅。
The pro-democracy legislators handed in their resignation letters and carried out a pledge to step down. The 15 opposition politicians stayed out of the council's morning meeting, leaving a large chunk of chairs empty. China, meanwhile, has defended the ouster of the 4 pro-democracy legislators in Hong Kong. Listen in.
作为香港特区的公职人员，立法会的议员当然必须真诚拥护中华人民共和国香港特别行政区基本法，效忠中华人民共和国香港特别行政区。没有任何一个国家会对包括议员在内的公职人员违背誓言。 背叛国家的行径视而不见。
The recent resignations and expulsions were spurred by a resolution that was passed by China's highest legislative body, the National People's Congress Standing Committee. This resolution allows the city's government to directly dismiss elected lawmakers without having to approach the courts. According to the resolution, lawmakers should be disqualified if they support Hong Kong's independence and fail to acknowledge China's sovereignty or encourage foreign forces to interfere in the city's affairs. Soon after the resolution was passed, the Hong Kong government announced that it was disqualifying 4 lawmakers. Earlier that day, 15 other pro-democracy leaders announced that they were resigning in solidarity. The mass resignations have now raised fresh questions about the future of the territory's democracy movement, as its legislature is left with almost no dissenting voices. This has invited fresh criticism and potential sanctions as well on China. Meanwhile, Britain has accused China of breaking its main bilateral treaty on Hong Kong by imposing new rules to disqualify the elected legislators. The Foreign Minister has cautioned that the UK would consider fresh sanctions.
It is my unfortunate duty to report to this House our judgment that this decision breaches the legally binding Sino-British Joint Declaration. It breaches both China's commitment that Hong Kong will enjoy a high degree of autonomy and the right to freedom of speech guaranteed under paragraph 3 of the Declaration. This is the 3rd time the government has called a breach of the Joint Declaration since 1997, but the 2nd time we've been forced to do so in the last 6 months. The decision is part of a pattern designed to harass and stifle all voices critical of China's policies. The new rules for disqualification provide a further tool in this campaign, with vague criteria open to wide-ranging interpretation. Hong Kong's people are left now with a neutered legislature. 15 pan-democratic legislators have already resigned en masse in protest. China has yet again broken its promise to the people of Hong Kong. Its actions tarnish China's international reputation and undermine Hong Kong's long-term stability.
Similarly, the National Security Advisor of the US has called out the Chinese Communist Party for violating its international commitments. The flagrant violations have been committed under the Sino-British Joint Declaration and its promises to the people of Hong Kong. Now, for more details about this development, WION's correspondent Richard Kimber joins us live from Hong Kong. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. Hong Kong has plunged further into crisis mode as the entire pro-democracy caucus has announced their resignation. So what will happen to Hong Kong's legislature? And do we expect Beijing to take action against these lawmakers?
Well, the democracy activists and the lawmakers who represent them are determined to keep on their campaign, despite the fact, as you've mentioned in your introduction there's no real opposition anymore inside the legislature. Despite that fact, all the lawmakers who resigned yesterday say they're going to continue campaigning on a grassroots level and continue lobbying for more international support. What's been happening in the last 24 hours with threats of sanctions from the UK after the threats of sanctions from the US is really exactly what many of these lawmakers are hoping for, and it's really exactly the motivation behind their decision to resign en masse. They said at the time that only by doing something as dramatic as that did they think it would actually help the world understand simply the level of frustration they feel towards the actual political process here. One of them describing yesterday as they resigned the fact that there's nothing left in the Hong Kong legislative chamber except what she described as false sincerity and fake speeches, and that really the entire legislative chamber is now designed to do nothing more than to just rubber stamp policies from Beijing.
Just the second part of my question there, do we expect Beijing to take a stock of the situation and take action against these lawmakers?
At the moment, it doesn't seem as though Beijing's planning to do anything. It doesn't really necessarily need to do anything because, after all, now the entire legislature is basically under its control. The pro-democracy lawmakers argue that it was probably under their control anyway because they had such a minority in the legislature in the first place. But the Beijing line has been consistent throughout this. It disqualified the 4 lawmakers on the basis that it deemed them to be a threat to national security, and it says that nobody is welcome anymore in the legislative chamber and nobody can justify their status as a legislator unless they are a patriot to the country and unless they can be deemed to be fulfilling the full and economic prosperity that Hong Kong is in line for. So really they're trying to make it much more difficult for strong anti-government activists to even get the position of being a lawmaker at all. So in the event that there are none left, then there's nothing necessarily for them immediately to do. The main question now comes with whether or not they will respond to any of the international criticism coming from outside and potentially try and block any form of sanctions coming from either the US or the UK.
Right, Richard, let's shift focus to another concern that you in fact just highlighted. The en masse resignation of the 15 remaining pro-democracy lawmakers has effectively removed any political opposition from Hong Kong's Legislative Council. So what will happen now to Hong Kong's autonomy?
Well, in terms of its ability to legislate, the chief executive here and the president of the actual Legislative Council have both said that this does not pose a serious threat to the future of Hong Kong's political process. They say that there will still be strong opposition even from within what is effectively now a pro-establishment camp. That's obviously up for debate, and many pro-democracy campaigners mocking the idea that there will be enough opposition from within what is effectively pro-government lawmakers. But really, in terms of the future autonomy of Hong Kong, it's looking increasingly difficult to see how there will be any form of real political debate in the city when, despite any efforts on the streets to campaign, there's no representation anymore on a political level. And we've seen even today, it looks likely that one of the most contentious government bills that's been hotly debated until this point between pro-government and anti-government legislators looks likely to be passed this afternoon, relating to a very expensive local government development project. And this is the kind of thing now that can pass very quickly through the legislature with no opposition, no filibustering as it's called, no delaying by opposition lawmakers, simply because there's no voices left in the chamber.
Right, Richard, just wrapping up our discussion here, my final question, will the global critique of Beijing's tightening grip on Hong Kong have any effect whatsoever on the Xi administration?
It seems very unlikely at this stage. We've had sanctions already from the US. We've not really had strong sanctions yet from the UK, but plenty of strongly worded statements. But really, during none of this time has Beijing shown any willingness to back down or to compromise. It's been very fixed and very consistent with its approach, constantly saying that all of the measures that it's taking are for the economic and political stability of Hong Kong. And it should be said that there are some sympathizers to that in Hong Kong. Certainly in the business community, the return to effective normal life, despite of course everything happening with the virus, has been very much welcomed by the business community, because the 6 months of last year amid all of the social unrest here really caused huge amounts of upheaval and uncertainty in the city. So despite the huge amount of pro-democratic voices in Hong Kong and frustrations with government, there is some level of sympathy towards the idea that these types of measures can ensure the economic prosperity, if nothing else, of the city going forward.
Right. All right, Richard, thank you so much for joining us on this broadcast, and thank you for all your insights.